My boyfriend's closest friend called me dumb and said I wasn't refined enough for him. So, I flipped the script and destroyed her PhD career in a single week. I had been dating Ethan for 3 years and everything was going smoothly. We met at a game night. Both aerospace engineers loved hiking and movies. I worked in a research lab developing satellite components and he did consulting for aviation companies. We had an easy rhythm of cooking together, talking about our work, supporting each other through problems, and simply enjoying each other's minds. Then, do you ever wonder what happens when the person you trust most starts believing a stranger over you? What if that stranger then tries to convince them you're too stupid to be loved? Because that's exactly what happened to me. And the aftermath, well, it was a slow burn reckoning that changed everything. Ethan and we had this beautiful, comfortable rhythm. We cooked together, talked for hours about our work, helped each other with challenges. We just got each other, or so I thought. Then, he went to a high school reunion and reconnected with Olivia. She was this brilliant theoretical physics PhD candidate, and suddenly, she was everywhere. In our hangouts, at our dinners. At first, I tried to be friendly. I even asked her about quantum physics, genuinely interested, because, it's cool stuff. But she'd respond in this patronizing, baby talk way, like she was explaining it to a 5-year-old. Then she'd turn to Ethan, batting her eyelashes, and say, "Wasn't it cute how I tried to understand?" Ethan would just chuckle. And I noticed she only did it when he was watching. Later, at dinner, she'd dominate the conversation with her research, then apologize for boring me with clever people stuff. "Excuse me? I have a master's degree." One night, we went to trivia, and the theme was space exploration. This is literally my job, so I naturally answered every single question correctly. Olivia, without missing a beat, told Ethan I probably just memorized facts without truly understanding them. And Ethan, he agreed. He suggested we give other teams a chance. I let it go, but something inside me froze. That was just the beginning. Soon, Ethan started questioning me about things he never had before. When I fixed our router, a simple thing, he asked if I was sure I knew what I was doing, or if I was just lucky. When I helped him optimize code for his project, something I'm incredibly skilled at, he validated it with Olivia. She told him there were mistakes. There weren't any. The absolute breaking point was at Ethan's workplace party. I was deep in conversation with his supervisor, discussing propulsion systems, a field I know inside and out. Olivia just waltzed up, introduced herself as Ethan's girlfriend, and then, completely out of the blue, added, "And I'm a lab technician." The supervisor, thinking I was the engineer who wrote a specific report on heat management, looked at Olivia confused. She actually chuckled and said, "Oh, it must be someone else with my name." The math on that paper was rather sophisticated. My blood ran cold. I corrected her instantly, but she'd already whisked Ethan away. On the drive home, Ethan actually brought it up. He said Olivia was concerned about our compatibility, that relationships work best when people are intellectual equals, and that I could be happy with someone on my level. My level. What was my level, exactly? He elaborated, saying Olivia thought I struggled with abstract concepts and relied too much on practical application. This woman, this stranger, had convinced my own partner that I was too foolish for him. I asked Ethan, point blank, "Do you agree with her?" He hesitated, then said she'd made some reasonable observations about how our interactions were superficial. Superficial? We'd spent an entire week analyzing the philosophical implications of sending consciousness to Mars. Just on the surface, apparently. In that moment, I understood everything. I saw the game she was playing, and the one he was falling for. But I chose to play the long game. I started acting confused when Ethan explained things. I'd ask Olivia to slow down when she spoke. I even bought a stack of popular science books and left them casually around the apartment. Olivia ate it up. They started referring to me as Ethan's nice, uncomplicated girlfriend. Meanwhile, I was cooking up something extraordinary. Olivia's doctoral supervisor was a Dr. Fitzgerald, a man I'd actually co-authored 5 papers with in the past. He had no idea she was even friends with Ethan. I casually reached out to him, asking about a new project combining quantum applications in satellite navigation. He was intrigued, and we started working together. Olivia had no clue her own mentor was emailing me her research to review, thinking my practical knowledge could help her theoretical work. And here's the problem with her research: it was derivative. She'd repackaged existing frameworks with overly complicated math that obscured, rather than clarified, her points. Her code was inefficient. Her findings, not grounded in real-world factors. I prepared a detailed assessment, pointing out every error, every omitted citation, every instance where practical application would tear her theory apart. Dr. Fitzgerald was mortified that he'd missed all of this. Then I found something worse. Whole paragraphs, lifted verbatim from obscure Russian periodicals, without proper acknowledgement. Not enough to trigger typical plagiarism detection, but enough to end a career. I documented everything. I emailed it all to Dr. Fitzgerald, expressing my profound concern about academic honesty. He called me immediately. The review board convened that week. Olivia was called in, probably expecting to discuss her upcoming defense. Instead, they showed her my findings. She tried to claim it was coincidence, but I had found 15 instances across 5 publications. Her funding was withdrawn. Immediately. She had 1 week to clear out her office. Ethan called me in a panic. Olivia was having a breakdown, saying someone had sabotaged her. She couldn't figure out who, because she'd alienated most of the graduate students already. Ethan, desperate, asked if I could help, despite everything. I replied, of course, and brought over cookies and tea. Olivia's office reeked of old coffee and printer toner. The room was tiny, overflowing with disorganized books and papers. She was slumped over her desk, face buried in her hands, shoulders trembling. The tea I'd brought sat untouched, steam curling into the air. I sat across from her and watched her cry. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. She kept repeating herself. Who could have set her up? The plagiarism results were impossible. She'd never stolen anything in her life. I nodded, made sympathetic noises, my hands clenching beneath the desk. Every time she looked up with those red, swollen eyes, I had to fight to keep my expression worried, instead of the triumphant grin I felt building inside. This was exactly what I'd planned, the result of weeks of meticulous preparation. But sitting there, watching her world crumble, felt different than I'd anticipated. Not horrible, just curious. She blew her nose and started reading the review board's conclusions again. I pointed at her computer screen, pretending to help her find a flaw. I leaned closer, feigning interest in the document I myself had written. She asked if I saw anything wrong with their findings, and I told her they seemed quite comprehensive. Her face crumpled again, and she buried it in her hands. My phone buzzed. It was Ethan. Has Olivia said anything about who could have reported her? I stared at the message, a cold dread spreading through me. He had no idea. He was messaging his fiancée for information while I sat across from his friend whose career I had just ruined. I replied that she was too emotional to speak clearly, which wasn't a lie, and asked him to give her space. He sent a worried emoji and said he'd check in tomorrow. I put my phone down and looked at Olivia. She was staring blankly at her screen. She asked if I thought Ethan would still want to be her friend after this. I assured her, of course he would. This doesn't change who you are as a person. The words felt empty, but she seemed to find comfort in them. She thanked me for coming, saying she didn't know what she'd do without my help. I stayed another 30 minutes, making her more tea, listening to her lament years of squandered work. When I finally left, she hugged me at the door and told me I was a great friend. The next week was a strange haze. Ethan kept sending me updates on Olivia, how she wasn't returning his calls, how worried he was. He said she'd always been so proud, and this must be hurting her. I agreed, advising him that she just needed time. We were on his couch Wednesday night when he brought it up again, asking if he should drive over to check on her. I warned him it might make things worse, that she was probably too humiliated to face anyone from her previous life right now. He nodded, but kept checking his phone. By Thursday, he asked if I'd heard from her. No, I replied. Friday, he wondered aloud if he should have seen the clues that something was amiss with her study. I bit my tongue and told him he wasn't a theoretical physicist, so he couldn't have known. He seemed relieved. By Saturday, he was asking if she'd be all right, if academic fraud was something you could recover from, if her career was truly over. I had to sit there, pretending to be equally concerned, nodding and saying encouraging things, all while feeling this bizarre mix of triumph and guilt. The guilt surprised me. I expected pure satisfaction, but I kept picturing her face in that tiny office, her hands shaking. Monday morning, back at the lab, I tried to focus. Julia, a colleague, found me in the break room pouring my third cup of coffee. She leaned on the counter, asking if I was okay. I brushed her off, saying work was tough, but she kept looking at me with this concerned gaze. She remarked I seemed different lately, more confident, but also more guarded, like I was holding something back. Then she asked if everything was all right with Ethan. My smile froze. That question hit me differently than expected. I'd been so focused on taking down Olivia, I hadn't really processed what all this had revealed about my relationship. Ethan had trusted Olivia over me. He'd questioned my IQ, my skill, my ability to grasp fundamental concepts in my own profession. He'd done it so easily, so quickly. 3 years of knowing me seemed to vanish compared to Olivia's pronouncements. I realized I hadn't absorbed any of that. I'd been so fixated on hurting Olivia that I hadn't considered why Ethan was so willing to believe I was too stupid for him. Julia was still waiting. I explained that things with Ethan were complicated. She asked if I wanted to talk. I declined. She squeezed my shoulder and went back to her desk. That night, Ethan came to my apartment with takeout. We ate on the couch, watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures. Halfway through, he paused it, looking at me with a serious expression. He'd been thinking a lot about Olivia's comments on our intellectual compatibility. My gut dropped, but my face remained neutral. He went on, saying he was starting to question if he'd treated me unfairly. Unfair? I asked, my voice flat. He squirmed, uncomfortable. He mentioned some of Olivia's observations about my difficulty with complex topics. Maybe they weren't true. Maybe he'd just been seeing what she wanted him to see. Rage began to swell in my chest, hot and fast. He was only questioning his actions now because Olivia had vanished, and he couldn't uphold her narrative anymore. Not because he'd realized the problem himself. Not because he'd reflected on how offensive his behavior had been. But because his source of knowledge was gone. Do you really think I struggle with abstract topics? I asked. He paused, then said he didn't realize Olivia had been persuading. The rage burned hotter. Do you remember our conversation about consciousness and Mars exploration? He nodded. Did it seem superficial to you at the time, until Olivia told you it was? He looked uneasy. He confessed. No, it hadn't. I put down my food. I stood up. Ethan asked where I was going. Nowhere, I said. I just need to move. I walked to the window, staring down at the parking lot. The conclusion formed in my mind, perfectly clear, as if it had been waiting there all along. I turned around. I need to tell you something. He put down his meal, sitting forward. Gently, calmly, I recounted everything. How I'd reviewed Olivia's research for Dr. Fitzgerald. How I'd discovered the plagiarism. How I'd documented it all, leading to her being booted from the PhD program. The words came out steadily, clearly. I told him about contacting Dr. Fitzgerald, about the quantum navigation project that was really just a pretense to access her work, about finding the plagiarized Russian documents. I revealed how I wrote the review that ended her career. How I was the one who reported her to the Academic Integrity Board. Ethan's face went absolutely white. He looked at me as if I had just confessed to murder. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, he whispered, "Why would you do something so terrible?" His voice was low, but I could hear the sheer astonishment. I walked back to the couch, sitting a deliberate distance from him. I reminded him of the router incident, when he questioned if I knew what I was doing. The code review, where he'd verified my work with Olivia, despite me having programmed longer than she'd been alive. The workplace party, where she told his boss I was just a lab worker, and laughed at the idea of me writing that report. I detailed the car ride home, when he said I'd be happier with someone on my level. I recounted every single time he'd questioned my intelligence based on her lies. Each incident spilled out of my mouth like evidence in a trial. His face grew paler with every example. When I finished, he tried to say something, but I held up my hand. "And what about trivia night? When you agreed we should give other teams a chance because I'd probably just learned things." He closed his mouth, staring at his hands. He started defending himself, claiming Olivia was compelling, had a PhD, and seemed like an intellectual authority. I cut him off. Was my one master's degree not compelling enough? Were my published research papers not authoritative enough? Were 7 years of experience in aeronautical engineering not proof enough that I understood abstract ideas? My voice rose with each question. Did you need Olivia to tell you I was brilliant, or should you have figured that out after 3 years of dating me? The pain on his face was clear now. He looked like I'd slapped him. Good. He was finally grasping the gravity of what he'd done to our relationship. He opened and closed his mouth, no words coming out. I waited. Eventually, he admitted he didn't know what to say. Hearing everything laid out like that, he understood how terribly he had screwed up. "It wasn't just that you messed up," I told him. "It's how quickly you were convinced of my incompetence. That a woman you hadn't seen since high school could walk in and make you question my basic IQ in a matter of weeks." Ethan then asked if the plagiarism was even real, or if I'd made it up to hurt her. That question infuriated me. I had to take a deep breath before I spoke. I was genuinely outraged that he still questioned my professional integrity. I got up, walked to my laptop, opened my email, and pulled up the data I'd sent Dr. Fitzgerald. I showed him the original Russian papers next to Olivia's work. I pointed out the similar paragraphs, the phrase patterns, the lifted formulas. I led him through all 15 cases, across 5 pages. I showed him how she'd modified just enough words to prevent automatic plagiarism detection, but kept the core concepts and structures without acknowledgement. I made him read the paragraphs himself, comparing them line by line. I watched his expression as he realized her deception was genuine, that I hadn't made anything up, that I'd just done my job as a reviewer and discovered what was truly there. He sank back, covering his face with his hands. He apologized, saying he should never have questioned whether I was making it up. I closed my laptop. "The plagiarism was real," I said, "but it doesn't change why I went looking for it in the first place." We spent the next 4 hours talking. Ethan apologized again, saying he had no idea how he'd let himself be twisted like that. He admitted he'd gotten caught up in Olivia's confidence and his own insecurities about not having a PhD himself. He'd always believed he wasn't smart enough, that his consulting job was somehow inferior to pure research. Olivia had played straight into that dread. She'd made him feel like he belonged to an elite intellectual club by agreeing with her judgment of me. I listened to it all, trying to figure out if I could forgive someone so quick to dismiss me as incompetent. Part of me understood that insecurity makes people do dumb things, but another part couldn't stop thinking about how swiftly he'd turned against me, how easily he'd bought her story. He asked what I was thinking. "I don't know yet," I said. "I need time to process everything, to figure out if trust can be rebuilt after something like this." He nodded. "I understand. I'll wait as long as you need." We sat at opposite ends of the couch. The documentary was still paused on the TV. The takeaway containers on the coffee table between us were cold. I left Ethan's apartment after midnight, my hands trembling on the wheel. His face, the way he looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time in months, replayed in my mind. Back in my apartment, I sat in the dark for an hour, trying to digest everything. The next morning, I texted Ethan, saying I needed space to think about us. He replied immediately, asking how much time. I honestly told him I didn't know. That evening, he showed up at my door with 3 boxes, his face pale and exhausted. He'd packed his belongings from my apartment without asking. I watched him carry out his spare work clothes, his toiletries, the book he'd been reading from my nightstand. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb anything. When he was done, he stood at my doorway, boxes in hand, and asked, "Is this what you want?" "It's what I need right now," I said. He nodded and left without another word. After he was gone, I walked through my apartment, noting the empty spots where his things had been. The bathroom counter seemed larger without his electric razor. The closet had a gaping space where his coats used to hang. But somehow, the place felt more like mine than it had in months. I realized I'd been sharing it with someone who didn't truly see me. And now, I could breathe again. 3 days later, I was at work, running simulations, when an email from Dr. Fitzgerald popped up. He thanked me again for my thorough review of Olivia's study, acknowledging my attention to detail had been essential. Then he mentioned that 3 other graduate students had come forward with concerns about joint projects they'd done with Olivia. Apparently, my initial examination had triggered a larger probe into her entire academic career. I sat there, staring at the email. A part of me felt a cold gratification, like I'd unearthed something that needed to be exposed. But another part felt terrible, because I was the one who started it all. Would anyone have ever discovered the plagiarism if I hadn't gone looking? If I hadn't been so angry about what she'd done to my relationship, would the other students have spoken up? I closed my inbox, trying to concentrate on work, but I couldn't stop thinking about how a single review had derailed someone's entire life. Friday evening, at 7 p.m., Julia found me at my desk, staring at simulation data I didn't even comprehend. She asked if I wanted to grab drinks. Without thinking, I said yes. We ended up at a pub near the lab, a place we used to go for team happy hours. Julia, sensing something was still off, asked what was going on. I hadn't intended to tell anyone the whole story, but it all spilled out. Olivia's undermining, Ethan's belief in her, discovering the plagiarism, conducting the academic probe, everything. I expected Julia to be shocked or even criticize me. Instead, she listened intently, then said, "You didn't manufacture anything. You just highlighted fraud that would have been uncovered eventually." She pointed out that Olivia's behavior towards me had been its own form of sabotage, trying to ruin my relationship and my boyfriend's respect for my career. If the plagiarism was real, Julia concluded, Olivia did this to herself. You just found it. Hearing someone else say it, so calmly, made me feel a little better. The following Tuesday, Ethan texted, "Could we talk again?" He'd been thinking a lot about his actions, he said, and understood the problem wasn't just Olivia. He acknowledged he'd always been intimidated by my practical skills, my hands-on experience. That vulnerability left him open when someone came along and claimed theoretical knowledge was superior. He wanted to discuss more, if I was willing. I stayed at the text for an hour. Part of me wanted to just dismiss it and move on, but another part needed to understand how it'd gotten here. I agreed to meet him for coffee on Saturday. When I arrived, Ethan was already at a corner table. He had a notepad in front of him, which seemed odd. After we ordered, he slid it across to me. On it, he jotted down a note for every time he'd questioned my IQ or ability over the past 7 months. There were so many more examples than I'd even realized. Times he'd asked if I was certain about something technical. Times he'd double-checked my work. Conversations where he'd explained things I already understood. Some of them, I'd completely forgotten. They seemed so small at the time. But seeing them all written down together It revealed a pattern that had started long before Olivia arrived. She hadn't caused it. She'd just made it so much worse. I read through the entire list, feeling the hate and anger rise up again. Ethan watched me, saying nothing until I finished. Then he asked, "Do you think we can fix this, or is the damage too severe?" We spent the next 4 hours discussing the very foundation of our relationship, questioning if it had ever been as strong as I'd imagined. Ethan reiterated his deep insecurities about not having a PhD, about being in consulting instead of research. He'd always worried he wasn't as intelligent as others in theoretical fields. Olivia's talk about esoteric concepts and quantum physics had made him feel like he was part of an intellectual club. Agreeing with her evaluation of me was his way of proving he belonged there. I told him that was a terrible reason to undervalue someone he supposedly loved. He agreed. He understood it was wrong, and he wanted to focus on trusting his own experiences with people, rather than just believing whoever sounded the most confident or had the most credentials. I asked if he truly believed he could change that tendency, which felt so deeply ingrained. He didn't know, he said, but he wanted to try, if I was willing to give him the chance. I told him I needed more time. Time to consider if I could ever truly trust him again. If the fact that he was so quickly convinced I was inept was something I could overcome. We left the coffee shop without making a decision about our future. That week, I kept reflecting. I decided I needed an outside opinion from someone who understood the professional ethics of what I'd done. I emailed Michael Jacobs, a former graduate school lecturer I'd stayed in touch with. I outlined the situation, how I'd discovered Olivia's plagiarism while reviewing her work, and asked about the ethics involved. Michael called me the next day instead of emailing back. He listened to the entire story, then said something that truly astonished me. He emphasized that exposing academic fraud was an ethical responsibility for anyone who detected it. He said that regardless of my personal motives for scrutinizing Olivia's work, discovering and reporting plagiarism was the right thing to do. The academic system, he explained, depends on people being honest about these issues. If I had discovered the fraud but not reported it, that would have been the ethical problem. My reasons for looking into her research in the first place didn't change the reality that what I discovered was true and needed to be addressed. Talking to Michael made me feel a little less awful about the whole situation. 2 weeks after Ethan moved out, I received an email that made my stomach drop. It was from Olivia. The subject line simply said, "I know it was you." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won out. Her email wasn't furious, as I'd feared. Instead, it was dejected, melancholic. She'd figured out my connection to Dr. Fitzgerald, probably by reading his emails after everything fell apart. She knew I was the one who'd reviewed her work, who'd found all the errors. Then she said something that truly surprised me. She admitted the plagiarism was real. She'd convinced herself the parallels to the Russian articles were accidental, that the concepts just seemed obvious to her. But when all 15 cases were presented together, she couldn't deny it. She'd become lazy and sloppy, she wrote, taking shortcuts because she was behind on her research schedule. She knew it was wrong, but she'd convinced herself it wasn't that bad. The email ended with her stating she didn't blame me for reporting it, because it was the truth. I read that email 3 times, trying to figure out how I felt. Part of me expected anger, accusations. Her acceptance, her acknowledgement of her own deceit, was harder to process. I didn't reply to Olivia's email, but I forwarded it to Ethan. He needed to see that his friend was both a fraud and someone who had deliberately tried to destroy our relationship. He called me 10 minutes after I sent it, his voice trembling. He started apologizing, saying he saw what had happened, that Olivia had exploited him while being intellectually dishonest the entire time. He felt stupid for not recognizing it sooner, for trusting her over me. I told him I appreciated his apology, but I still didn't know what it meant for us. We spent another hour discussing everything. At the end, Ethan asked if I wanted to try couples counseling. He understood we had severe trust and communication issues he couldn't fix on his own, that if we were to save our relationship, we needed professional help. I was shocked he suggested it. Ethan had always been wary of therapy. But I decided to try. I wasn't ready to give up on us. We started seeing a therapist the next week. The first session was awkward, uncomfortable. We sat on opposite ends of a beige couch, trying to explain what brought us there. The therapist asked questions about our history, about Olivia. Over the following sessions, she helped us identify patterns we'd both overlooked. She pointed out Ethan's anxiety about his education and career had led him to overvalue theoretical knowledge and academic credentials, while undervaluing real-world experience. That dynamic had left our relationship vulnerable to someone like Olivia, who presented herself as intellectually superior. The therapist also helped me reflect on my actions, how I'd chosen retribution over open communication, how I'd contributed to Olivia's impression of me as less intellectual by not standing up for myself earlier. She said we both needed to focus on communication and trust if we wanted to rebuild anything meaningful. Ethan began addressing his insecurities, learning to respect different kinds of intellect and skill. I focused on being more open about my emotions, rather than letting bitterness fester until I did something destructive. It was a painstaking process, and some sessions were incredibly difficult, with both of us getting defensive or upset. But eventually, things slowly began to improve between us. 3 months passed. Things with Ethan improved, but they also changed. We communicated more about how we felt, instead of assuming we understood each other. When I was hurt by something he said, I told him immediately, rather than letting it build up. When he felt insecure about his career or our relationship, he expressed it directly, instead of taking it out on me in strange, oblique ways. However, there was a new level of caution between us, a subtle vigilance that hadn't existed before. It was like we were both looking for signals that the other might distrust us again. I'd occasionally find myself waiting to see if he'd question my decisions, and I could see him doing the same, waiting to see if I was upset or plotting something. It wasn't necessarily bad, just different from the easy trust we used to share. We were building something more honest, but it required more effort, more focus. One Tuesday afternoon, my boss called me into her office. I braced myself, assuming I'd messed up a satellite component test. Instead, she told me I was being promoted to senior engineer. The role came with a significant raise and my own team to oversee the next generation navigation systems project. I sat there, stunned. I'd been so consumed with Ethan and Olivia that I hadn't even realized the promotion cycle was underway. My boss said it was an easy decision. My published research and technical contributions over the past year had been superb. I thanked her, walking back to my desk with a strange mix of pride and relief. That night, when I told Ethan about the promotion, he instantly hugged me. He said how incredibly proud he was. He insisted on throwing a celebratory dinner that weekend, inviting all our friends and some of his coworkers. At the dinner, he started telling people about my research papers, my technical expertise, without me even asking. He identified specific projects I'd worked on and explained why they were significant. It felt like a test we were both passing, him demonstrating his appreciation for my efforts, and me allowing him to celebrate my accomplishment without questioning his motives. A few weeks later, Julia approached me at work during lunch. She had an uneasy expression. She'd heard something about Olivia through academic networks. Olivia hadn't just taken a break from her PhD program. She'd dropped out entirely. She'd moved back to her hometown in Ohio to work for her family's commercial real estate firm. Julia said she thought I should know, given how chaotic the situation had been. When I heard the news, a confused knot formed in my gut. Part of me felt relieved. Olivia had faced serious consequences for her deceit and her attempt to harm my relationship. She'd been exposed as a fraud and lost the career she'd been so proud of. But another part of me felt uneasy with how utterly her life had fallen apart. I had discovered actual plagiarism and poor research. That was true. But I'd done it with the clear intention of hurting her because of what she had done to me. The magnitude of her collapse, losing everything she'd worked for, having to quit academia altogether, felt heavier than I had anticipated. I thanked Julia for telling me and returned to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about it for days. Ethan and I discussed Olivia's situation that weekend. I told him what Julia had said, admitting to feeling awkward about it. He validated my feelings, explaining why I'd done what I did, and how Olivia had brought the consequences on herself through her own dishonesty. But he also acknowledged that he understood I was probably conflicted about being the one who started it. We agreed to keep working on our relationship, to stay together, to continue going to therapy, to build something more honest than what we had before. What had happened had affected both of us. I realized, now, that I was capable of premeditated retribution, of plotting and carrying out someone's downfall in a very intentional way. That was an unsettling realization about myself. Ethan understood that he was capable of betraying someone he loved, not through purposeful malice, but through weakness and insecurity, by allowing others to distort his perceptions. We were creating something more authentic than the comfortable rhythm we used to share. It was harder work, and less comfortable, but it felt more solid, as if we understood who we were now, flaws and all, and still chose each other. The fatigue was still there, but there was something deeper, too. What about you? Have you ever had to confront a deep betrayal in a relationship, or found yourself doing something you never thought you were capable of? I'd really love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.